Most people believe kindness disappears without anyone noticing. They're wrong. Sometimes one small act of compassion changes an entire kingdom. Rain drifted across the streets of Boston in long silver ribbons, turning every traffic light into blurred reflections on the pavement. Hazel Adams tightened her grip on the insulated delivery bag resting beside her as the windshield wipers swept steadily across the glass. It had already been a 14-hour shift. The coffee in her cup holder had gone cold hours ago, her phone battery hovered below 20%, and the delivery app reminded her she still had one final order before the night was over. She let out a quiet breath and smiled to herself. One more stop, one more tip, one more day she had managed to keep moving forward. The neighborhood ahead looked almost deserted beneath the steady rain. Front porches were dark, storefronts had closed, only a few passing headlights interrupted the silence. As Hazel approached an old bus stop near a quiet intersection, something caught her attention. An elderly woman stood completely alone beneath the faded shelter, wearing a thin grey coat that offered almost no protection from the cold. Her silver hair clung gently to her face, and although several cars drove past, not one slowed down. Hazel continued another 50 yards before glancing into her rearview mirror. The woman was still standing there. She checked the delivery timer on her phone, then looked back once more. The customer could wait a few extra minutes. Some things mattered more than perfect ratings. She made a careful U-turn and parked beside the curb before stepping into the rain. Holding her own jacket above both of them, she offered a warm smile. "Ma'am, are you all right?" The woman slowly turned toward her. Despite the rain and the late hour, her pale blue eyes remained calm and strangely bright. "I'm afraid I may have lost my way," she admitted, with an apologetic smile. "I thought I remembered this neighborhood better than I do. Do you remember your gently?" The woman closed her eyes for a moment before quietly speaking the name of a street on the opposite side of the city. Hazel recognized it immediately. It was at least 8 miles away. Public buses had stopped running nearly an hour earlier. "If you don't mind," Hazel said softly, "I can drive you home after I finish my last delivery. It won't take long." The elderly woman studied her face for several quiet seconds, almost as though searching for something beyond words. "You would do that for someone you've never met?" Hazel shrugged with an easy smile. "I'd hope someone would do the same for my grandmother." Something gentle passed across the older woman's expression before she nodded once. "Then I would be grateful." 20 minutes later, Hazel completed her final delivery and returned exactly where she had promised. The woman was still waiting patiently beneath the shelter. She climbed into the passenger seat, thanking Hazel as the heater slowly filled the little sedan with welcome warmth. Soft music drifted quietly through the speakers while the rain continued tapping against the roof. For several minutes they simply drove together in comfortable silence. "You work very hard," the woman eventually said. Hazel laughed quietly. "Does it show that much?" "Your hands tell stories," the woman replied. Hazel glanced briefly at the faint scratches across her fingers from endless cardboard boxes and grocery bags before smiling again. "Occupational hazard. Do you have family waiting for you tonight?" the woman asked. Hazel kept her eyes on the road. "Not anymore. It's just me these days." The woman looked out the window without another question, but the silence between them somehow felt comforting instead of awkward. Nearly half an hour later, they turned onto a tree-lined road Hazel had driven past dozens of times before, yet tonight something felt different. At the end of the road stood an enormous stone estate surrounded by elegant iron gates she could have sworn had never been there before. As she slowed the car, the gates began opening by themselves without anyone approaching them. Hazel blinked, assuming someone must have activated them remotely from inside. She parked beneath the covered entrance and stepped out to help the woman. No staff appeared. No voices echoed through the enormous property. Before walking away, the elderly woman gently placed one hand over Hazel's. "Thank you," she whispered with quiet sincerity. "Kindness has become a rare language." Hazel modestly, "I'm just glad you made it home safely." The woman held her gaze for one lingering moment as though committing her face to memory forever. "No," she answered softly. "You have done far more than you realized tonight." Hazel watched the woman disappear behind the towering front doors before returning to her car, never noticing the nearly invisible security cameras slowly turning to follow her departure. What she didn't know was that before the next sunrise, the most powerful man in the vampire world would arrive at her apartment for one reason, and one reason alone. Hazel barely thought about the mansion again as she drove back through the sleeping city. Boston slowly disappeared behind streaks of rain while the delivery app finally displayed the message she had been waiting to see all night. Shift complete. She leaned back against the driver's seat and allowed herself a small smile. It had been an ordinary evening. Long hours, cold weather, one final delivery, and one unexpected act of kindness. Nothing more, or at least that was what she believed. Less than a mile away, behind the towering stone walls she had just left, dozens of silent figures stood perfectly still beneath the grand entrance hall. None of them dared to speak first. The elderly woman calmly removed her damp grey coat and handed it to a waiting attendant before looking toward the enormous staircase. Her posture had changed completely. The uncertainty that Hazel had seen at the bus stop had vanished. Every movement now carried quiet authority. The attendants lowered their heads without being asked. A man in an elegant black suit stepped forward carefully. "Your Majesty," he said respectfully. "We have been searching all night." The older woman simply smiled. "I know. Should we inform His Majesty immediately?" She glanced toward the rain-covered windows. "Yes. Tell my son I have finally found someone worth meeting." "Do you wish to explain why?" "Not yet." Her answer was calm but absolute. "Tomorrow morning will explain everything." While the mansion quietly awakened with unusual activity, Hazel arrived at her small apartment building on the opposite side of the city. The parking lot was nearly empty except for a few aging sedans glistening beneath the streetlights. She carried her insulated delivery bag upstairs, kicked off her soaked shoes near the door, and laughed quietly at how silent the apartment felt. It was not loneliness anymore, it was simply home. She placed the last of her delivery receipts on the kitchen counter before heating a bowl of leftover soup. Her phone buzzed with a notification from the delivery company congratulating her on another 5-star rating. She smiled politely at the screen before setting it aside. Somehow, the compliment that stayed with her was not from a customer. It was the gentle voice of the elderly woman thanking her for speaking the language of kindness. Hazel found herself wondering whether the woman had family waiting inside that enormous house. She hoped someone had prepared a warm meal and a dry blanket. After all, nobody that age should ever stand alone in the rain. She fell asleep with that simple thought still lingering in her mind. At exactly 6:30 the next morning, the first rays of sunlight slipped through her apartment blinds. Hazel woke to an unusual silence outside. She stretched, brewed fresh coffee, and prepared for another day of deliveries. Everything felt completely normal until she looked out her living room window. She froze. Parked neatly along both sides of the street were several identical black luxury vehicles. Their polished surfaces reflected the morning light like mirrors. Men and women dressed in perfectly tailored dark suits stood beside each vehicle, remaining completely motionless. None of them spoke. None of them checked their phones. Every pair of eyes remained focused on the entrance to Hazel's apartment building. She frowned. Maybe someone important lived nearby. She dismissed the thought and continued getting ready. 5 minutes later, she stepped outside, carrying her delivery bag over one shoulder. The moment the apartment door opened, every suited figure straightened at exactly the same time. Hazel stopped halfway down the front steps. The quiet street somehow became even quieter. A final black sedan rolled slowly toward the curb before coming to a perfectly smooth stop. Its rear door opened. A tall man stepped onto the sidewalk with calm, deliberate movements. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit beneath a long black overcoat. His dark hair was neatly combed back, and his face carried the composed expression of someone completely accustomed to command. People walking on the opposite side of the street slowed without realizing why. Even from a distance, there was something quietly extraordinary about him. Hazel had never seen him before. She instinctively assumed he had mistaken the building. The man walked directly toward her. His pace remained unhurried. His silver-grey eyes never left her face. Hazel looked behind herself, wondering whether he intended to greet someone else. There was no one there. He stopped only a few feet away. Without saying a single word, he lowered himself onto one knee. The movement was graceful, deliberate, and utterly unexpected. Every suited figure surrounding them immediately did the same. The entire street fell silent. Hazel stared in complete disbelief as the stranger lowered his head with unmistakable respect. Then, in a calm voice that carried across the quiet morning air, he finally spoke. "Miss Hazel Adams, on behalf of my family, thank you for bringing my mother safely home." Hazel could only stare at the man kneeling before her, convinced she had somehow stepped into the wrong morning. She looked from his lowered head to the rows of perfectly dressed men and women mirroring the same respectful posture, then back toward the apartment entrance, as though expecting someone else to appear and explain the impossible scene unfolding outside her building. Instead, the neighborhood remained strangely quiet. A woman walking her dog had stopped across the street. A mail carrier stood frozen beside his truck. Even passing traffic seemed to slow as curious drivers glanced toward the gathering without understanding what they were witnessing. Hazel cleared her throat softly. "I think there must be some kind of mistake." The man slowly lifted his head without appearing theatrical, refined in a way that seemed untouched by time. His pale grey eyes held neither arrogance nor urgency, only quiet gratitude. "There is no mistake, Miss Adams," he answered calmly. "You showed compassion to someone precious to my family when no one else stopped." Hazel shook her head with a nervous smile. "I only drove an elderly woman home because she looked lost. Anyone would have done that." A faint warmth touched the corners of the man's expression, almost like the beginning of a smile. Unfortunately, yesterday proved otherwise. He rose smoothly to his feet, and every person behind him stood at precisely the same moment. The movement was so perfectly synchronized that Hazel felt another chill despite the mild morning air. "My name is Dominic Rousseau," he continued. "I owe you a debt of gratitude that cannot be measured by money or gifts." Hazel blinked. The name meant nothing to her, yet something about the way he carried himself made the surrounding city seem unusually ordinary by comparison. "Your mother is doing all right?" she asked instinctively. Dominic nodded once. "She arrived home safely because of you." Relief softened Hazel's face. "That is all that matters." Dominic watched her carefully. Most people, after seeing the vehicles, the security detail, and the obvious wealth surrounding him, would have immediately asked questions about his identity or his fortune. Hazel asked only about his mother's well-being. It was exactly what his own mother had predicted. What Hazel did not know was that less than 24 hours earlier, the Queen Mother had described her in almost identical words. Kind before curious. Compassion before ambition. Dominic reached into his coat pocket and removed sealed with dark crimson wax. There was no family crest visible, only a simple embossed rose. He extended it toward Hazel with both hands. "My mother wishes to invite you to our home for dinner tomorrow evening." Hazel looked at the envelope but made no move to accept it. "That is really thoughtful, but I do not think it is necessary. I was happy to help." "She insists." His voice remained gentle. Hazel hesitated before carefully taking the invitation. The paper itself felt unusually thick, almost handcrafted. "I appreciate it," she said honestly. "Please thank her for thinking of me." Dominic inclined his head slightly. "She already believes you deserve the thanks in person." Another silence settled between them, though it felt entirely different from the awkwardness Hazel expected. It was calm, respectful, almost peaceful. She noticed that none of the people standing behind Dominic had spoken a single word since arriving. They simply waited with remarkable discipline, their attention focused only on him. "Can I ask you something?" Hazel finally said. "Of course." "What does your family do?" For the briefest moment, something unreadable passed through Dominic's eyes before disappearing as quickly as it had come. "We have protected certain traditions for a very long time." It was an answer that explained almost nothing, yet somehow it did not sound dishonest. Hazel accepted it with a polite nod. She had met enough private people during her delivery routes to know when not to pry. Dominic noticed that too. "You are wondering why all of this was necessary," he said, gesturing toward the convoy surrounding them. Hazel laughed softly. "I would be lying if I said it was not unusual, perhaps." Another faint smile appeared, but gratitude should never be hidden. Across the street, several neighbors had quietly gathered near the sidewalk, whispering among themselves as they watched the extraordinary meeting. Dominic glanced toward them before returning his attention to Hazel. "We have already taken enough of your morning. You have work to do." Hazel looked down at the insulated delivery bag still hanging from her shoulder and laughed again. "Yes, bills do not usually wait, neither does kindness," Dominic replied. Before she could respond, he stepped back. Every member of his entourage moved with silent precision toward the waiting vehicles. Doors closed almost simultaneously. Engines started with barely a sound. Within seconds, the entire convoy pulled away from the curb as smoothly as it had arrived, leaving only the quiet residential street behind. Hazel stood motionless with the invitation still resting in her hands, wondering whether the entire encounter had somehow felt more like a dream than real life. She looked once toward the elegant wax seal before slipping the envelope carefully into her delivery bag. Unfortunately for her, accepting that invitation would carry her far beyond anything she believed existed inside the ordinary world she had always known. The following evening arrived far more quickly than Hazel expected. She spent the entire day completing deliveries across Boston, yet every time she reached into her insulated bag for the next receipt, her fingers brushed against the cream-colored envelope Dominic Rousseau had given her that morning. It remained perfectly smooth despite the countless miles she had driven. By the time her final delivery was complete, the sun had already disappeared behind the skyline, leaving the city wrapped in cool shades of blue and gold. Hazel returned to her apartment with barely enough time to change into the nicest outfit she owned, a simple navy dress she had purchased years earlier for a friend's wedding. Standing in front of the mirror, she almost laughed at herself. She still did not fully understand why someone with a mansion, a fleet of luxury cars, and a security team had invited an ordinary delivery driver to dinner. More than once she considered declining. Yet every time she remembered the elderly woman's grateful smile, the decision became easier. This dinner was not about wealth, it was about kindness. At exactly 7 o'clock, a familiar black sedan stopped quietly outside her apartment building. There were no flashing lights, no dramatic arrival, only the same calm precision she had witnessed that morning. A gentleman wearing a tailored dark suit stepped out and opened the rear passenger door before greeting her with a respectful nod. "Miss Adams, welcome." His Majesty asked that your journey be as comfortable as possible. Hazel hesitated for only a second before thanking him and stepping inside. The vehicle glided through evening traffic almost silently. Downtown Boston slowly gave way to quieter neighborhoods before the streets became lined with towering oak trees once again. This time Hazel recognized the road immediately. The estate no longer felt like an illusion. As the car approached, the massive iron gates opened smoothly without anyone visible nearby. Warm golden lights illuminated the stone mansion, revealing details she had been unable to see during the storm. Ivy climbed across the ancient walls. Elegant fountains reflected the evening sky. The entire property carried an atmosphere that felt timeless rather than extravagant. The sedan stopped beneath the grand entrance, where several attendants stood waiting in perfect silence. Hazel instinctively reached for the door herself, but before she could touch the handle, it was gently opened from outside. "Good evening, Miss Adams," one attendant said warmly. "Her Majesty has been looking forward to seeing you again." The words caught Hazel slightly off guard. Her Majesty. Before she could ask what he meant, the front doors opened. The elderly woman she had driven home stepped forward with the same gentle smile Hazel remembered from the rainy bus stop. Tonight she wore an elegant, deep blue gown instead of the simple grey coat, and although nothing about her expression had changed, everyone surrounding her immediately lowered their heads. Hazel suddenly understood why. The older woman was not simply respected inside this home. She was honored. "You came," the woman said happily as she reached for Hazel's hands. "I was hoping you would." Hazel smiled, still trying to process everything around her. "Thank you for inviting me." "No," the older woman replied softly. "Thank you for accepting." She gently guided Hazel through the entrance hall. Marble floors stretched beneath towering ceilings where crystal chandeliers cast warm light across centuries-old paintings and carved wooden walls. Yet despite the breathtaking surroundings, what caught Hazel's attention most was the atmosphere. No one hurried, no one spoke loudly, every servant greeted one another with quiet respect. The mansion felt less like a palace and more like a family protecting traditions that had existed for generations. Dominic appeared at the far end of the hall wearing a charcoal suit without the overcoat he had worn that morning. He approached with the same composed confidence, offering a courteous nod rather than any grand display. "Miss Adams, welcome. Thank you for having me," Hazel answered. "I hope I am not underdressed." Dominic glanced at his mother before looking back at Hazel. Kindness has always been the proper attire in this house. His answer made the Queen Mother smile with unmistakable pride. As they walked deeper into the estate, Hazel noticed portraits lining the walls. Generation after generation of remarkably elegant men and women looked down from ornate frames. Many shared strikingly pale features and calm grey eyes that resembled Dominic's. She slowed briefly before one particularly old portrait depicting a regal woman whose face looked astonishingly familiar. "She looks just like you," Hazel said quietly to the Queen Mother. The older woman followed her gaze before smiling with gentle amusement. Families often carry familiar faces longer than they expect. Before Hazel could study the painting more closely, a distant grandfather clock echoed softly through the hall. The Queen Mother turned toward Dominic with an almost imperceptible nod. "It is time." Dominic offered Hazel his arm with quiet courtesy. "Dinner is ready." Hazel accepted politely, still believing she had simply been invited into the home of an extraordinary family. What she did not know was that beyond the dining room doors, dozens of the oldest members of that ancient household had already gathered in complete silence, each waiting to see whether the woman who had unknowingly changed the Queen Mother's heart would also change the future of an entire kingdom. The dining room was unlike anything Hazel had ever imagined, yet it did not impress her because of its size. It impressed her because of its silence. A long polished table stretched beneath crystal chandeliers, illuminated by hundreds of warm candles whose reflections shimmered across the marble floor. Every chair was already occupied by elegantly dressed guests, yet no conversation filled the room. Instead, every pair of eyes quietly followed Hazel as she entered beside Dominic and the Queen Mother. There was no hostility in those expressions, but neither was there immediate warmth. It felt as though each person was carefully observing a page of history before deciding what to think about it. Hazel instinctively slowed her pace. She had delivered meals to expensive homes before, but nothing had prepared her for this. Dominic noticed the hesitation and matched her slower steps without saying a word. It was a small gesture, almost invisible, yet it reminded Hazel she was not expected to navigate the unfamiliar evening alone. The Queen Mother smiled gently as she reached the head of the table. Every guest lowered their head at the exact same moment before taking their seats only after she had done so. Hazel quietly followed Dominic to the chair beside him, still uncertain why she had been placed so close to the head of the table. An elderly gentleman across from her offered a polite nod. A woman with silver hair smiled kindly before returning her attention to the Queen Mother. Others remained almost impossible to read. Dinner began with quiet elegance. Attendants moved gracefully through the room, serving each guest with remarkable precision. No one rushed, no one interrupted another person. Even ordinary conversation carried an unusual sense of respect. Hazel noticed something else as well. Everyone listened more than they spoke, as the conversation slowly shifted toward everyday subjects. One guest discussed restoring an old library. Another mentioned a community scholarship program. Someone else described rebuilding a historic theater after years of neglect. None of the discussions revolved around wealth or influence. Instead, they centered on preserving people, places, and traditions. The atmosphere felt strangely comforting. The Queen Mother eventually turned toward Hazel with an affectionate smile. "How was your day?" she asked. Hazel laughed softly. "Much less exciting than yesterday." Gentle laughter spread around the table, easing some of the quiet tension. "Mostly grocery deliveries. A birthday cake, 2 pharmacy orders, and one customer who insisted I take homemade cookies before I left." "Did you?" the Queen Mother asked. "Of course," Hazel replied with a grin. She looked disappointed when I tried to refuse. More smiles appeared around the room. Dominic watched the exchange without interrupting. He had expected polite conversation. Instead, Hazel spoke naturally with the same warmth she had shown his mother at the bus stop. She never tried to impress anyone. She never searched for approval. She simply answered every question honestly. What Hazel did not know was that nearly every guest around the table had already received detailed reports describing her life before she arrived. They knew she worked long hours. They knew she lived alone. They knew she had declined better-paying jobs because flexible delivery work allowed her to volunteer at a neighborhood food pantry twice each month. Yet hearing her speak revealed something no written report ever could. Kindness was not something she performed. It was simply who she was. One distinguished gentleman finally addressed her directly. "Miss Adams," he said politely, "may I ask why you stopped your car yesterday?" Hazel looked at him with mild surprise. "Because someone needed help. Many people drove past." "I know. Why did you stop when they did not?" Hazel considered the question carefully before answering. "I cannot decide what other people do. I can only decide what I do." Silence settled across the room once again, though this time it felt entirely different. Several guests exchanged thoughtful glances. The gentleman gave a slow nod before saying nothing more. The Queen Mother's eyes softened with unmistakable satisfaction. Dominic quietly reached for his glass, concealing the faint smile that almost appeared. No rehearsed answer could have sounded more sincere than the simple truth Hazel had spoken without hesitation. Across the table, another elder carefully opened an old leather-bound journal resting beside his chair. Without comment, he wrote a single line across the page before closing the cover once again. Hazel noticed the movement, but assumed it was nothing more than personal notes. She returned her attention to the conversation, completely unaware that every answer she gave this evening was being quietly remembered. As the final plates were cleared away, the Queen Mother rose from her chair. Every guest immediately followed. She looked around the room before resting her gaze on Hazel. Tomorrow, she said gently. If you are willing, I would like to show you something very few people have ever seen. Hazel smiled, curious but completely at ease. The Queen Mother nodded warmly. Wonderful. At the far end of the room, the elderly gentleman who had written inside the leather journal watched Hazel for one final moment before closing the book with quiet certainty. Unfortunately for Hazel, she still believed this remarkable evening had been nothing more than a generous family's expression of gratitude, never realizing that every ordinary choice she made was quietly shaping a decision that had waited centuries to be made. The following afternoon arrived beneath clear autumn skies, and for the first time in days, Boston felt unusually peaceful. Hazel finished her morning deliveries early, her thoughts returning more than once to the Queen Mother's invitation. Curiosity had quietly replaced uncertainty. Whatever this remarkable family wished to show her, it clearly meant more than another elegant dinner. Shortly before noon, the same black sedan arrived outside her apartment. This time the familiar driver greeted her with the warm smile of someone welcoming an old friend rather than escorting an unexpected guest. The drive passed in comfortable silence, and before long the great stone estate appeared once again beyond rows of towering oak trees glowing with shades of gold and crimson. As the gates opened, Hazel noticed details she had overlooked before: gardeners carefully trimmed ancient hedges. Children laughed somewhere beyond the trees, though none could be seen. Birds circled above marble fountains whose water reflected the bright afternoon sun. Nothing about the estate felt cold or intimidating. Instead, it felt surprisingly alive. The Queen Mother waited for Hazel beside an enormous glass greenhouse overflowing with flowers that somehow remained in perfect bloom despite the changing season. She welcomed Hazel with the same gentle embrace she might have offered a granddaughter returning home after a long journey. "I thought we might take a walk," she said. Hazel smiled. "I would like that." They entered the greenhouse together, where sunlight filtered through the towering glass ceiling and covered the stone pathways with shifting patterns of light. Thousands of flowers surrounded them in every imaginable color. The air carried the gentle fragrance of roses, jasmine, and lavender. It was difficult to believe such peaceful beauty existed only a short drive from the crowded city. For several minutes neither woman hurried to speak. They simply admired the quiet surroundings while soft fountains echoed somewhere deeper inside the greenhouse. Eventually, the Queen Mother stopped beside a white rosebush. "Tell me something, Hazel," she said softly. "When was the last time someone showed you unexpected kindness?" Hazel considered the question much longer than she expected. "Honestly, yesterday." The Queen Mother tilted her head with interest. Hazel smiled. "Your family, I still cannot understand why everyone has treated me with so much respect after something so ordinary." The older woman's expression remained thoughtful. "Perhaps because what you call ordinary has become extraordinary." They continued walking. A small wooden bench overlooked a pond filled with bright koi drifting peacefully beneath floating lilies. The Queen Mother gestured toward it, and they sat together. "Another question," she said gently. "If you suddenly possessed great wealth, what would change first?" Hazel laughed quietly. "Probably my car." The Queen Mother laughed with her. A practical answer. Hazel nodded. "After that, I suppose I would pay off my apartment, help the food pantry where I volunteer, and maybe create a scholarship for delivery drivers trying to finish college. A lot of people work incredibly hard, but never get noticed." The Queen Mother looked toward the pond without speaking. Somewhere behind them, footsteps quietly approached before stopping again. Hazel never turned around, unaware Dominic had entered the greenhouse only moments earlier. He remained several yards away, careful not to interrupt. The Queen Mother asked one final question. "What do you believe people fear most?" Hazel watched gentle ripples move across the pond before answering. "Being invisible." The older woman remained silent. Hazel continued thoughtfully. "Not physically invisible, emotionally invisible, feeling like nobody notices whether you are struggling or whether you are doing your best. I think everyone wants someone to see them." The greenhouse grew remarkably still. Even the distant fountain seemed quieter. Dominic lowered his eyes for a brief moment as though the answer had reached somewhere unexpectedly personal. His mother slowly turned toward Hazel. "And how do we make someone feel seen?" Hazel answered without hesitation. "By treating them like they matter before we know whether they can do anything for us." Another long silence followed, but this one carried unmistakable weight. The Queen Mother's eyes shimmered with quiet emotion, though she quickly composed herself with a gentle smile. "Thank you," she whispered. "That is a beautiful answer." Hazel smiled modestly. It is only what I believe. She never noticed Dominic quietly closing his eyes for a single breath before looking toward the greenhouse ceiling, nor did she see the elderly steward standing discreetly near the entrance, lowering his head with profound respect. No one spoke of what had just happened. Instead, the Queen Mother stood and invited Hazel to continue their walk among the flowers, as though the conversation had been nothing more than two friends sharing an afternoon together. What Hazel did not know was that every answer she had given inside the greenhouse perfectly matched words, recorded centuries earlier inside the royal family's oldest journals, and for the first time in generations, those who had guarded the kingdom the longest were beginning to believe that the future they had waited for had quietly arrived in the form of an ordinary delivery driver who never once realized she was being tested. The Queen Mother did not speak again until they reached the far end of the greenhouse, where an old wooden door opened into a quiet library unlike anything Hazel had ever seen. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves stretched upward beneath a vaulted ceiling, and afternoon sunlight spilled through tall windows onto polished oak floors. The room felt peaceful, almost sacred, carrying the quiet weight of generations. Dominic waited beside one of the windows, his posture calm, his expression composed. He offered Hazel a respectful nod before stepping aside, allowing his mother to lead the way. The Queen Mother rested one hand gently on the back of an antique chair. "There is something I have owed you since the night we met," she said softly. Hazel smiled with quiet confusion. "You have already thanked me more times than anyone ever has." "Not for that," the older woman replied. "For allowing me to tell you the truth." Hazel's smile slowly faded into curiosity. She took a seat as invited while Dominic remained standing a respectful distance away. The Queen Mother walked toward a large portrait hanging above the fireplace. It depicted the same elegant woman Hazel had noticed in the hallway, wearing a deep blue gown remarkably similar to the one she wore now. "Do you remember asking why everyone here treats me with such respect?" Hazel nodded. "I do. The answer is simple." The older woman turned to face her with gentle honesty. "Because I am the Queen Mother of this family and Dominic is its king." Hazel blinked several times, convinced she had misunderstood. The words sounded impossible, yet neither Dominic nor anyone else laughed or corrected them. The silence itself confirmed that no one considered the statement unusual. "King?" Hazel repeated quietly. Dominic answered with the same calm voice he had used outside her apartment. "Titles matter far less than responsibilities, but yes, my family has looked after our people for centuries." Hazel searched both of their faces for any sign that this was an elaborate joke. She found none. Instead, she found remarkable sincerity. "I still do not understand," she admitted. "If all of this is true, why were you standing alone at that bus stop?" The Queen Mother smiled, though this time the smile carried a hint of sadness. "Because I chose to be there." Hazel frowned. "You chose to get lost. I chose to disappear." The older woman's voice remained gentle. "Months ago, I began leaving this estate without telling anyone where I would go. Sometimes I visited crowded neighborhoods, sometimes quiet parks, sometimes grocery stores or bus stations. I dressed simply. I carried no title. I wanted to know whether kindness still existed when there was nothing to gain from showing it." Hazel remained silent, absorbing every word. "Many people were polite," the Queen Mother continued. "Some offered directions. Others apologized before walking away because they were too busy. I judged no one for that. Life is difficult. But I kept searching for someone who would stop without asking whether helping me was convenient." Dominic quietly lowered his eyes. He had heard this story before, yet hearing his mother tell it to Hazel somehow gave it new meaning. The Queen Mother looked directly at Hazel. Then, on a rainy evening, one exhausted delivery driver turned her car around after driving past me. Hazel immediately shook her head. "Anyone with time would have done the same." "No," the Queen Mother answered with quiet certainty. "Dozens did not." The room fell silent again. Hazel remembered the empty street, the rain, the cold bus shelter, and how natural the decision had seemed at the time. She had never imagined anyone could view that simple moment as extraordinary. "I did not choose you because you helped me," the Queen Mother continued. "I chose to know you because you never once asked whether I deserved your kindness. You offered it before you knew my name, my home, or my station in life." Hazel lowered her eyes toward her hands. For the first time since entering the estate, she did not know what to say. Dominic finally spoke. "My mother believed our people had spent too many generations admiring power while overlooking character." His voice remained steady, revealing only what Hazel could observe. She wanted proof that compassion still existed in the world beyond these walls. Hazel looked back toward the Queen Mother. "And you believe that person is me?" The older woman stepped closer and gently took Hazel's hands exactly as she had done outside the mansion on the rainy night. I believe you reminded me that greatness is measured by how we treat those who cannot repay us. Tears did not fall, but Hazel felt her throat tighten with quiet emotion. Never in her life had anyone described her ordinary choices with such significance. Before she could gather her thoughts, a soft knock echoed through the library door. An elderly steward entered with measured steps before bowing respectfully to the Queen Mother. "Your Majesty," he said quietly, "the Royal Council has assembled. They have learned that the search is over, and they are requesting an immediate audience." The Queen Mother's warm expression remained unchanged, but the atmosphere inside the library shifted almost imperceptibly. Hazel had finally learned why the remarkable family had welcomed her so warmly. What she still did not know was that not everyone waiting beyond those doors would greet that truth with the same quiet gratitude. The walk from the library to the council chamber felt longer than it truly was. Hazel followed the Queen Mother through wide stone corridors lined with portraits whose watchful eyes seemed to carry centuries of memory. Dominic walked beside her without speaking, his pace measured, his expression calm. He did not offer reassurance, nor did he attempt to explain what awaited beyond the carved wooden doors ahead. Somehow that quiet confidence steadied Hazel more than empty promises ever could. She reminded herself to breathe. Whatever this royal council was, she had no intention of pretending to be someone she was not. Two attendants slowly opened the towering doors. Warm light spilled across polished marble as Hazel stepped into a circular chamber unlike any room she had seen before. Instead of a throne, a large round table occupied the center of the room, surrounded by distinguished men and women dressed with timeless elegance. Every conversation stopped the instant the Queen Mother entered. One by one, every member of the council rose respectfully. Hazel noticed that none of them appeared surprised to see Dominic. Their attention settled almost entirely on her. It was not the curious attention she had experienced during dinner. This felt heavier, more deliberate, as though every person in the room had arrived carrying years of expectations. The Queen Mother took her seat first. Dominic remained standing beside her chair. Only then did the others sit. Hazel quietly accepted the empty chair that had been prepared across from them, trying not to let the silence overwhelm her. An elderly council member with silver hair folded his hands together before speaking. "Your Majesty, we have gathered because we understand the search has ended." His voice remained respectful, though undeniably cautious. The Queen Mother nodded once. "It has." A younger councilwoman glanced briefly toward Hazel before returning her attention to the Queen Mother. "May we ask whether the reports are accurate?" "You may," the Queen Mother answered. "Every report is accurate." Another silence followed. Hazel looked from one face to another, realizing she understood almost nothing about the conversation unfolding around her. Finally, the silver-haired gentleman turned toward her with a polite smile. "Miss Adams, thank you for joining us." Hazel returned the smile. "Thank you for inviting me. May I ask a simple question?" "Of course. Before last week, had you ever heard of our family?" Hazel shook her head honestly. "No." "Did you know who the Queen Mother was when you met her?" "No." "Did you expect anything in return for helping her?" Hazel almost laughed at the idea. "I expected her to get home safely. That was enough." The gentleman nodded thoughtfully without another word. Across the table, another council member spoke for the first time. If someone else had been waiting beside her that evening, someone who appeared wealthier or more important, would you still have stopped? Hazel looked mildly confused. "Why would that matter? Please answer as you see fit." She smiled gently. "Because two people would have needed help instead of one." A few council members exchanged quiet glances, others remained perfectly still. Dominic watched the room rather than Hazel, carefully observing every reaction without interrupting. What Hazel did not know was that many of those seated around the table had expected rehearsed answers, careful diplomacy, or an attempt to impress them. Instead, she continued answering every question with uncomplicated sincerity. An elegant woman seated near the far end of the chamber finally leaned forward. "Miss Adams, suppose you learned that helping the Queen Mother had changed your own future forever. Would you regret stopping that night?" Hazel took a thoughtful breath before replying. "If helping someone changes my future, then I hope it changes it by making me a better person. Otherwise, it would not have been worth much." The room became completely silent. No one hurried to fill it. The Queen Mother rested both hands gently upon the table, her eyes never leaving Hazel. Dominic remained motionless, but the faintest warmth softened his expression for only an instant before disappearing again. The silver-haired gentleman slowly stood. "Your Majesty," he said respectfully, "I now understand why you ended the search." Before anyone else could respond, another council member rose as well. Unlike the others, his expression carried visible concern rather than curiosity. "With respect," he began carefully, "understanding is not the same as agreement." Several heads turned toward him. His voice remained courteous yet firm. "Miss Adams appears honorable. No one here questions her kindness, but kindness alone has never determined matters of this importance. Our traditions exist for reasons that have protected this kingdom across generations." Hazel lowered her eyes briefly, realizing she had unknowingly become the center of a discussion that reached far beyond her understanding. She had never asked to stand before a royal council. She had never imagined one ordinary decision could place her inside a room where centuries of tradition were now being debated. The Queen Mother remained perfectly calm. "Then let us discuss those traditions honestly," she said. "Because for the first time in many years, they are being asked the question they were always meant to answer." As the council members slowly prepared to speak one after another, Hazel quietly realized that earning the Queen Mother's trust had only opened the first door. Winning the hearts of those who believed the old ways should never change would prove far more difficult. When the council chamber finally grew quiet again, the Queen Mother looked around the circular table with calm patience rather than authority. She did not interrupt those who questioned her decision, nor did she dismiss centuries of tradition. Instead, she allowed every concern to be spoken openly. Hazel remained silent, listening far more than she spoke. She understood that this conversation had begun long before she entered the room, and whatever happened next would shape far more lives than her own. The council member who had challenged the Queen Mother stood once again. His voice remained respectful, but every word carried the weight of long-held conviction. "Your Majesty, our concern is not whether Miss Adams is kind. We all recognize that she is. Our concern is whether one act of compassion should influence decisions that affect generations to come." Several others nodded quietly. Hazel lowered her eyes for a moment. She never wanted anyone to argue because of her. Before she could speak, Dominic finally stepped away from his mother's side. Every eye followed him as he walked slowly toward the center of the chamber. His movements remained calm, deliberate, and completely unhurried. When he spoke, his voice carried no anger, only quiet certainty. "No one here believes this decision rests upon one evening." He looked around the room before continuing. "If that were true, my mother would never have invited Miss Adams into this house." The council listened without interruption. "For months," Dominic said, "the Queen Mother walked through cities, neighborhoods, parks, train stations and hospitals without revealing who she was. She met thousands of people. Some offered directions, some offered sympathy. Some simply walked away because life demanded their attention elsewhere. None of them were judged for that." Hazel glanced toward the Queen Mother, who answered with a small approving nod. Dominic continued, "This was never a search for perfection. It was a search for consistency. Character reveals itself through ordinary moments repeated over time." He turned toward Hazel for only a brief moment before facing the council again. "Since meeting Miss Adams, every report we have received tells the same story. She volunteers when no cameras are present. She helps strangers who cannot repay her. She treats every person with equal respect regardless of status." Hazel felt heat rise to her face. She had never imagined anyone had been quietly observing such ordinary parts of her life. What she did not know was that every investigation had been conducted only after the Queen Mother insisted that kindness should never be assumed from a single encounter. Dominic's voice softened slightly. "Then we must recognize it wherever it appears." The chamber remained silent. Finally, the silver-haired council member slowly stood again. "Your Majesty," he said, "perhaps we have spent too many years measuring strength by influence instead of integrity." Several members quietly lowered their heads in thoughtful agreement. Even those who remained uncertain no longer questioned Hazel herself. They questioned only whether old traditions should change. The Queen Mother rose gracefully from her chair. "Traditions survive because they remember their purpose," she said gently. "The moment they exist only to preserve themselves, they stop serving the people they were created to protect." Hazel looked around the chamber, realizing the atmosphere had begun to change. Faces that had once seemed distant now appeared thoughtful. Some even smiled politely whenever their eyes met hers. She still felt out of place, yet no longer unwelcome. As the meeting concluded, council members quietly departed in small groups, continuing their conversations in respectful voices. No dramatic announcement had been made. No formal vote had taken place. Instead, something far more meaningful had happened. Minds had begun to open. Dominic waited until the chamber had nearly emptied before approaching Hazel. "I owe you an apology," he said. Hazel looked surprised. "For what?" "For allowing you to enter all of this without understanding how much attention would fall upon you." Hazel smiled gently. "You did not force me to come," Dominic returned the smile, small but genuine. "No, you chose to." They stepped onto a wide stone balcony overlooking the estate as the sun slowly disappeared beyond the autumn trees. Warm evening light painted the gardens in shades of gold, and for the first time since they had met, there was no audience watching them, and no expectation beyond simple conversation. Hazel rested her hands lightly against the balcony railing. "May I ask you something?" Dominic nodded. "Anything." She looked toward the distant city skyline before speaking. "Yesterday, you said gratitude should never be hidden. Is that truly how you lead?" Dominic followed her gaze. "Power is remembered for a generation. Kindness is remembered much longer." Hazel smiled quietly. "Then your mother taught you well." Dominic did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the gardens where the Queen Mother walked peacefully among the flowers below. "She never asked me to become the strongest ruler," he said at last. "She only asked me to become the kind of man who would never ignore someone standing alone in the rain." Hazel's smile widened as the evening breeze carried the scent of roses across the balcony. Neither of them realized that below, the Queen Mother had paused beside the garden path, watching them from a distance with quiet satisfaction. She had searched for kindness in the human world, but what she was witnessing now was something even rarer. Two people beginning to change each other without either one asking for anything in return. Morning sunlight spread gently across the estate, washing the ancient stone walls with a warm golden glow that made the entire property feel less like a hidden kingdom and more like a place where time had simply learned to move more slowly. Hazel stood near the gardens, watching gardeners carefully tend roses that had bloomed long past their usual season. Every person she passed greeted her with quiet respect, yet none treated her like someone extraordinary. They simply treated her as though she belonged. That simple difference stayed with her more than any grand gesture ever could. Dominic found her beside a small fountain where crystal-clear water flowed over smooth white stone. "Good morning," he said with the same calm warmth she had come to recognize. Hazel smiled. "I think this is the quietest place I have ever visited." Dominic glanced around the gardens before answering. "Peace is something we protect carefully here." Together they walked through shaded pathways lined with ancient oak trees whose branches stretched high above them. There was no formal escort, no council members, and no servants following behind. For the first time since arriving at the estate, they were simply two people sharing an ordinary conversation. Hazel looked toward a group of young volunteers arranging boxes of donated food near one of the estate's community buildings. "I did not expect this," she admitted. "Neither did most visitors." Dominic replied. "The estate supports shelters, schools, hospitals and neighborhood programs throughout the city. My mother always believed leadership should be measured by what people outside these walls experience, not by what happens inside them." Hazel watched the volunteers laughing together as they loaded supplies into waiting vans. "Then she and I would probably agree on many things." Dominic allowed himself a genuine smile. "I suspected as much." They continued walking until they reached a quiet overlook where the Boston skyline stretched across the distance beneath a clear blue sky. Hazel rested her hands against the stone railing. "Can I tell you something honestly?" she asked. "Always," Dominic answered. She looked toward the city instead of at him. "Ever since I came here, everyone has spoken as though I changed something important, but I still delivered groceries yesterday morning before coming here. My apartment is still the same. My old car still needs repairs. My life does not suddenly feel different because someone called me extraordinary." Dominic considered her words before speaking. "Perhaps your life has not changed because of who you have become. Perhaps ours has." Hazel turned toward him with quiet surprise. He continued in the same steady voice. "Many people spend their lives searching for remarkable people. My mother searched for someone who never tried to appear remarkable at all." Hazel lowered her eyes with a modest smile. "I never wanted to impress anyone." "Exactly." They stood together in comfortable silence while a gentle breeze carried the scent of autumn leaves through the gardens. What Hazel did not know was that members of the Royal Council were quietly watching from a nearby terrace. They had not gathered to judge her anymore. They had come to observe whether the sincerity they had witnessed inside the council chamber remained unchanged when no one appeared to be watching. One by one, they saw the same quiet kindness reflected in every ordinary conversation she shared with the gardeners, the volunteers, and the staff. There was no performance, no ambition, only consistency. Later that afternoon, the Queen Mother invited several council members to the estate's community centre, where volunteers prepared care packages for families across the city. Without anyone asking, Hazel rolled up the sleeves of her simple sweater and joined the volunteers at one of the long wooden tables. She packed food, sorted blankets, folded children's coats, and laughed easily with people she had only just met. Dominic watched from across the room. No announcement introduced her. No one reminded the volunteers who she had become to the royal household. Most simply assumed she was another person offering to help. By sunset, dozens of boxes had been loaded for delivery. As the final truck departed, the silver-haired council member approached the Queen Mother with a thoughtful expression. "Your Majesty," he said quietly, "today no tradition was challenged." The Queen Mother looked toward Hazel, who was helping sweep the floor alongside several volunteers despite repeated offers from others to let them finish instead. "No," she answered gently. "Today we remembered why our traditions existed in the first place." The council member smiled for the first time since Hazel had entered the estate. "Then perhaps the future has already begun." Across the room, Hazel thanked an elderly volunteer for showing her where to store the remaining supplies before picking up her delivery bag, which she had left near the entrance that morning. Even after everything she had experienced, she still carried it over one shoulder out of habit. Dominic noticed the familiar bag and quietly walked beside her toward the evening light. Neither of them realized that the greatest debate had already ended. It had not been settled by speeches, titles, or authority. It had been settled by countless ordinary choices that proved kindness remained exactly the same whether anyone important happened to be watching or not. The next morning, the Queen Mother asked Hazel to meet her outside the estate rather than inside its grand halls. A single black sedan carried them away from the mansion, past familiar neighborhoods, until they reached the same quiet bus stop where everything had begun. The rain was gone now, replaced by gentle autumn sunlight that filtered through the old maple trees overhead. Hazel stepped onto the sidewalk and immediately recognized the worn wooden bench and the cracked concrete where puddles had gathered only days before. She smiled softly. "It feels different now," she said. The Queen Mother looked around the empty street with quiet affection. "The place has not changed, only the way you see it has." For a long moment they stood together in comfortable silence. Cars passed by without noticing them, just as they had on that rainy evening. Finally, the Queen Mother spoke. "Do you know why I kept returning to this neighborhood?" Hazel gently shook her head. "Because this street reminded me that true character is rarely found in places where people expect to be admired. It is found where no one believes they are being watched." Hazel lowered her eyes, remembering the exhaustion she had felt that night. "I almost kept driving," she admitted quietly. "I was tired." "But you turned around," the Queen Mother answered with a warm smile. "That is the only part history will remember," Hazel laughed softly. "History usually forgets delivery drivers. Not this time." They slowly began walking along the same sidewalk where their paths had first crossed. The Queen Mother carried no symbol of authority, only a simple walking cane she scarcely needed. Anyone passing by would have seen nothing more than a grandmother enjoying a peaceful morning with a younger friend. What Hazel did not know was that several members of the Royal Council observed quietly from a respectful distance, not to judge her anymore, but because they wished to witness the final chapter of the Queen Mother's search with their own eyes. After several minutes, they stopped beneath the familiar bus shelter. The Queen Mother rested one hand lightly upon the weathered bench. "For many years," she said softly, "I believed our future depended upon finding someone extraordinary. I searched among scholars, leaders, philanthropists, and people celebrated by the world. Every one of them possessed impressive qualities, yet almost all of them expected recognition before offering compassion." She turned toward Hazel with unmistakable warmth. "Then I met someone who believed kindness required no audience." Hazel felt unexpectedly emotional. "I still do not know why you speak about me that way, because it is true." The Queen Mother's voice remained gentle. "You never tried to become important. That is precisely why your character could be trusted." Before Hazel could answer, she noticed Dominic approaching along the sidewalk. He had come alone without an escort or security detail. Dressed simply in a dark coat, he looked less like a king and more like a man enjoying an ordinary walk beneath the autumn sky. He stopped beside them and offered his mother a respectful nod before looking toward Hazel. "I hope I am not interrupting." The Queen Mother smiled knowingly. "You are arriving exactly when you should." She took a small step back, leaving the two of them standing together beneath the bus shelter. Dominic looked toward the quiet street before speaking. "There is something I have wanted to tell you since the day we met. When I knelt outside your apartment, many people believed I was honoring the person who helped my mother." He paused briefly. "That was only part of the truth." Hazel looked at him with quiet curiosity. Dominic continued in the same calm voice. "I was also honoring the values she spent centuries teaching me never to forget. You reminded me that leadership begins long before anyone wears a crown. It begins the moment we choose to notice another human being." Hazel smiled, her eyes reflecting both gratitude and humility. "I did not change those values, they were already inside you." Dominic's expression softened into the warmest smile she had seen since they first met. "Perhaps. But sometimes even old lessons need someone new to bring them back to life." The Queen Mother quietly watched the exchange from a few steps away. Around her, members of the Royal Council slowly lowered their heads, not because anyone had commanded them to, but because every remaining doubt had disappeared. They no longer saw Hazel Adams as an unexpected visitor from the human world. They saw the woman whose ordinary choices had reminded an ancient kingdom why its greatest traditions had been created in the first place. As the morning sunlight illuminated the familiar sidewalk, the Queen Mother looked toward the place where she had once stood alone in the rain and smiled with peaceful certainty. The search that had carried her through countless streets, countless strangers, and countless years had finally come to its quiet and beautiful end. The afternoon sun settled gently over the estate, bathing the gardens in warm amber light as preparations quietly unfolded throughout the grounds. There were no lavish decorations, no extravagant displays meant to impress outsiders, only rows of fresh flowers, polished stone pathways, and families gathering together with calm anticipation. Hazel walked slowly beside the Queen Mother through the gardens, still carrying the quiet humility that had guided every step of her life. She looked around at the people smiling as they greeted one another, and found herself wondering how a place she had feared only days ago had begun to feel unexpectedly familiar. "Everyone seems happy," she said softly. The Queen Mother smiled. "Because hope has returned. Not because someone new arrived, but because everyone remembers why we exist." Hazel nodded thoughtfully. She had spent so much of her life believing that extraordinary moments announced themselves with noise and celebration. Instead, the most meaningful changes seemed to arrive quietly, almost unnoticed, before transforming everything around them. Dominic joined them near the center fountain carrying 2 cups of fresh coffee. He handed one to Hazel with an easy smile. "I remembered you always prefer coffee over tea." Hazel accepted it with quiet surprise. "You remembered that? You mentioned it during dinner." She laughed softly. "I did not think anyone noticed." Dominic looked toward the volunteers arranging tables for a community gathering beyond the gardens. "People feel valued when they are noticed." Hazel lowered her eyes. Remembering her own words inside the greenhouse only a short time earlier, she smiled, realizing he had remembered them as carefully as she remembered his. Throughout the afternoon, families from nearby neighborhoods arrived at the estate carrying homemade dishes, children's drawings, and baskets filled with bread, fruit, and flowers. No one treated the gathering as a royal celebration. Instead, it felt like neighbors coming together after years apart. Hazel joined the volunteers without hesitation, arranging chairs, helping children decorate long wooden tables, and greeting elderly guests as they arrived. Nobody asked her to do any of it. Helping simply remained her first instinct. What she did not know was that members of the Royal Council quietly watched from nearby terraces one final time. Not to evaluate her anymore, not to test her, only to appreciate the consistency that had already transformed every doubt into confidence. As evening approached, the Queen Mother gently tapped her glass, inviting everyone to gather beneath the ancient oak tree overlooking the gardens. Conversation faded into peaceful silence. She stepped forward with Dominic, standing respectfully beside her while Hazel remained among the volunteers, believing she was simply another guest. The Queen Mother looked toward Hazel with unmistakable warmth. "A few days ago," she began, "I stood alone at a bus stop believing that perhaps the world had become too hurried to notice those who quietly needed help. I was wrong. Gentle smiles spread throughout the gathering. One young woman reminded me that compassion does not ask who deserves it. It simply chooses to appear. Hazel felt dozens of kind eyes turn toward her. Embarrassed, she lowered her gaze before the Queen Mother continued, "Today I ask all of you to remember something important. Titles may guide a kingdom, wealth may build great homes, strength may protect our future, but only kindness gives any of those things lasting purpose." A quiet wave of applause followed, not loud or dramatic, but heartfelt. Dominic stepped toward Hazel as the gathering slowly resumed around them. "There is one last thing I wish to ask," he said. Hazel smiled nervously. "After everything that has happened, I am almost afraid to guess." Dominic laughed softly, the sound warmer than she had ever heard before. "Do not worry. There are no more surprises." He paused before speaking again. "You once said that people want someone to see them before asking what they can offer in return. My mother spent centuries teaching me that lesson. You reminded me never to forget it." Hazel listened quietly. "I cannot promise that life beside my family will always be simple," Dominic continued, "but I can promise that you will always be respected for exactly who you are, never for what anyone expects you to become." Hazel looked around the gardens one final time. She saw volunteers laughing together, children chasing one another beneath the trees, elders sharing stories on nearby benches, and the Queen Mother watching every moment with peaceful contentment. None of it felt like a world she needed to escape from. It felt like a world she genuinely wished to help grow. She looked back at Dominic with, "I am not choosing a palace," she said gently. "I am choosing the people inside it." Dominic's smile answered before words ever could. He quietly offered his hand, not as a king making a royal command, but as one equal inviting another to walk beside him. Hazel accepted without hesitation. Around them, the evening breeze carried the scent of roses through the gardens, while the Queen Mother closed her eyes for a brief moment of gratitude. The search that had begun with quiet hope had now become something even more meaningful. It had become the beginning of a future built not upon destiny or power, but upon two people who had freely chosen kindness first and each other second. Several months later, a light autumn rain returned to Boston, soft enough to leave a silver shimmer across the sidewalks without chasing people indoors. The city looked almost exactly as it had on the evening when one exhausted delivery driver had made a simple choice that no one else noticed. Yet everything had changed. The community center supported by the estate had become busier than ever, welcoming families, students, volunteers, and neighbors every day. New scholarship programs helped delivery drivers continue their education. Local shelters received steady support without seeking recognition. Hospitals quietly accepted anonymous donations that arrived exactly when they were needed most. No newspaper ever connected those changes to the ancient family living beyond the oak-lined road. They had never wanted credit. They only wanted the world beyond their gates to become a little kinder than it had been yesterday. Hazel still visited the neighborhoods where she had once delivered groceries, although her reasons had changed. She spent mornings helping organize community outreach projects before joining volunteers throughout the city in the afternoons. People often recognized her warm smile before they remembered her name. She greeted everyone with the same quiet kindness she had always carried, never allowing admiration to replace humility. Dominic remained exactly as he had promised. He never placed her above others or expected her to become someone different. Instead, he walked beside her through schools, shelters, hospitals, and neighborhood events, listening far more than he spoke. Those who met him often remembered his calm presence before they ever noticed the quiet authority he carried. The Queen Mother watched their work with peaceful satisfaction, knowing that the future she had hoped to find had never depended upon titles. It had depended upon character. One rainy afternoon, Hazel and Dominic finished visiting a neighborhood food pantry before deciding to walk the final few blocks rather than return immediately to the estate. A gentle breeze carried the scent of wet leaves through the familiar streets. As they approached an old bus stop, Hazel slowed without realizing why. It was the very same place where everything had begun. The weathered wooden bench remained. The faded route map still leaned slightly beneath the shelter. Even the old maple tree stood exactly where it always had, its branches quietly sheltering the sidewalk below. Hazel smiled as memories returned. Before she could speak, she noticed an elderly man standing alone beneath the shelter, holding a small paper grocery bag while looking uncertainly up and down the nearly empty street. Rain dotted the shoulders of his worn jacket. Several cars passed without stopping. Hazel instinctively took one step forward. At that exact moment, Dominic was already walking toward the man carrying the umbrella they had been sharing. Without hesitation, he held it above the stranger's head before offering a warm smile. "Good afternoon, Toon, sir," he said gently. "Can we help you get where you are trying to go?" Hazel reached them a moment later, smiling as naturally as she had on the night she first met the Queen Mother. "We have room in the car if you need a ride," she added. Relief immediately softened the man's face. "I was afraid I had missed the last bus," he admitted quietly. "Then today is your lucky day," Hazel replied. Together they helped him into their waiting car, making certain his groceries stayed dry along the way. Across the street, beneath the shelter of a flowering tree, the Queen Mother sat quietly on a nearby bench, with a gentle smile that reached her eyes. She had asked no one to meet her there. She simply wished to see whether kindness had truly taken root. Watching Dominic and Hazel care for a complete stranger without the slightest expectation of reward, she finally closed the small journal she had carried throughout her search. There would be no more names to record, no more streets to wander. No more questions waiting to be answered. Her search was over because the lesson had already begun to spread from one heart to another. As the car pulled away, the rain continued falling softly over the quiet neighborhood. But no one stood alone beneath the bus shelter anymore. Months earlier, one ordinary woman had turned her car around because she believed a stranger mattered. Now 2 people carried that same belief wherever they went, proving that the greatest legacies are never built by power alone. They are built one unnoticed act of kindness at a time. And on that peaceful autumn afternoon, while the city carried on without realizing history had quietly changed beside an old bus stop, one truth remained beautifully certain. Even the oldest kingdoms endure only when someone still chooses to stop for a stranger standing alone in the rain.